Hello everyone, welcome back. In my last video, I showed the Dragon's Lair bot that I wrote, doing a complete playthrough of the first Dragon's Lair game, in which it beat the game flawlessly, didn't make a single mistake. As promised, this is the follow-up video in which I go over all of the source code. This was written in AutoIT or AutoIt, I'm not sure which the developer calls it. But it's actually a really simple program. The first thing I did before writing it was get several screenshots of the game. These screenshots showed me both the buttons when they were not lit up and the buttons when they were lit up, so I could find the positions of the buttons as well as what color various points on the button turned when they lit. Anything that was not the lit colors were considered to be an unlit button. I took 3 to 5 coordinates off of each button, and that guaranteed that it didn't just have some weird artifacting if I checked multiple coordinates to make sure that they were all valid. So without any further ado, let's begin. The first part's just the credits and the licensing information. None of that's very interesting. Then we get to set up the hotkeys. As demonstrated in the previous video, F3 starts it running, F4 closes the program, and F5 pauses. The reason I had to use hotkeys instead of being able to click something on the screen is that Dragon's Lair is a full screen game. So as soon as you click on the window for the bot, it actually minimizes or at least shoves Dragon's Lair to the background. This is not ideal because you can't see what it's doing. So the ability to pause with a keystroke or start it with a keystroke is a much better mechanism. The next section just sets up the GUI. It sets it to 64480, which is much larger than it actually needs to be, given that the interface is actually rather small. That could obviously be changed, and titles the window Dragon's Lair bot. The next section is just the coordinates for the buttons. There's nothing real fancy about that. It just displays the GUI controls information, so we can tell what color each point on each button is. The sword color I have more coordinates for than I do for the other buttons, just to make it a little more accurate. I noticed in testing originally that sometimes it wouldn't be 100% accurate without more coordinates for that button in terms of distinguishing on versus off. The buttons are all semi-transparent, so sometimes it gets a little wonky with its detection mechanisms, but those bugs have all been ironed out long ago, at least on my system. A variable for pause, just to track whether or not the game is, or the bot, I mean, is actually doing anything. And if you notice, all of these variables begin with a H for these handles, B for boolean. This is because AutoIT's docs specify that the coding convention should be that variables begin with the type of variable. So I've kept with that. It's not something that I normally do because I think it looks weird in modern programming languages, modern source code, but just to keep with convention, that's how I ended up doing it. Here's the main loop. Actually going up a little more, here's just a loop that runs indefinitely until something else kills the script, in which case it'll end but that would be F4. And here's the main loop. The main loop checks all of the buttons to see if they are lit up. So if check up checks the up button, check down the down button, etc. And if it is lit up, then it clicks the primary mouse button, which for most people is going to be their left mouse button, at a point within that lit button on the screen. So these are all points on the screen in 1920 by 1080. As I referred in my initial video, these points would need to be changed for any other screen resolution. So that's why the bot only works in my main monitor now, and it's 1920 by 1080. This would be easy to check. So I have to, and in fact, it lower my resolution before playing the game if I want to use change dynamically based on again, what screen resolution the user was running the game in. You could modify the bot to detect the current resolution. At the time, all of my monitors, the maximum setting was a different set of values based on that. That is no longer true. It's not something I felt the need to do. If we go back especially to the beginning, since I was just writing this to see if like I could make 4 years ago now. It was more of an exercise than actually something I planned on using frequently. The main thing would be just getting new screenshots and figuring out the positions on the buttons, and then updating this or updating it to use an array for different resolutions and adding a detection method. But yeah, that's all pretty simple. This waits for roughly a 1/16 of a second. I had it at an 1/8 of a second, and it would win the game, but it would die once or twice. It just wasn't pulling enough, especially in hard mode, to detect every single time the button lit. 1/16 of a second seems more than enough. I could probably split the difference and go maybe 1/10 of a second, but this wasn't causing any undue processor load or anything, so I just left it here. And here's the functions. All of these are basically alike. They could probably just be made into a more generic function. But that's, again, this was mostly just for an exercise to see if I could do it, so I didn't really feel the need to combine things as much as I could have. But this could certainly just take a parameter to see which button and then look up the values in an array and then fill them in from that. It's getting the pixel color for 3 points. As I said earlier, each button looks at somewhere between 3 and 5. I think it's 3 or 4 now. I think I've reduced it. Just to make sure that some stray value didn't get in there either through artifacting or, as I said, the buttons are semi-transparent, so sometimes that messes with any specific color value on the button. So, and it only does this if paused, so the bot basically takes no CPU if you've currently got it paused. And if the colors are set, then it returns true, otherwise it returns false. Again, all of these are the same. The only difference is for the sword, to make it more accurate, it has 4 positions that it checks, not just 3. So here's where we check the color, and any of you who have experienced low-level graphics programming in the 1990s will probably recognize a little bit of what's happening here. But basically with red, green, blue color numbers, red is going to be the top 2 digits, green is going to be the middle 2 digits, and blue is going to be the bottom 2 digits. So with this AND, we're clearing everything except the red portion. And then with this shift, we are moving these 8 bits here, this byte, down 2 bytes or 16 bits so that it's in the lowest portion and setting red to that. In other words, we're just taking this part, whatever was here, and storing it in the red value. Likewise, we're clearing out the red and the blue portions and shifting it down 1 byte. So this moves down to here, setting that to green. There's no shifting needed for this because it's already in the lowest portion. So we're just clearing out everything else and setting blue to that. And this part here is testing to see if the button is lit. If the red and green are both higher than a certain value and the blue is lower than that value, then it is a valid shade of yellow. I had to do some fairly extensive testing with this originally. As I said, um, the buttons are semi-transparent, so they're not going to be a specific color at each of the points. They are going to be a color blended with whatever was behind them. This value seemed to work well. I seem to get 100% hits and 0 misses, no false positives, no false negatives. So I guess in the medical field, high specificity, high sensitivity. And that's what we want here. Again, I haven't had any problems. You can watch my previous video where the game was played flawlessly by the bot. Those numbers could probably be tweaked, but I don't know. I don't know of any better values for it. Like I said, this was just trial and error. There may be a better value. This might miss once in a while or pick something up that it shouldn't once in a while. Although, as far as I know, there's no penalty for clicking a button when you're not supposed to. So false positives probably don't matter anyway. Here's the pause function. Again, 80s and 90s low-level programmers probably recognize this. Maybe some other programmers as well. But just to toggle something on and off, you can XOR it with 1. 1 XORed to 1 would be 0. 1 XORed to 0 would be 1. So it just toggles. It's a one-line way to do that in most languages. And terminate, if you press F4, just exits. And again, those were all defined up here. So when you press F3, it calls that start function, which is the main loop. When you press F4, it terminates, which is what we just looked at. And F5 calls pause. That's the callback function for it, which is the function that just toggles that pause bit. So nothing real complicated. Actually, none of the program itself is that complicated. This is really the only thing that probably warranted explanation, just because it's non-obvious. At least I think so. It took me a minute to remember what I was doing here. I should probably comment that, but that may be non-obvious to people on what's actually happening there and why those values were chosen. And again, those values were chosen just by trial and error. They seemed to work, so those are the values that ended up sticking around. And yeah, not really a whole lot to this. I think a lot of these simpler games could probably be botted in this many lines or fewer. Also, I normally use VI for all of my editing, but for auto IT, I normally skip that habit because auto IT allows you to immediately check your syntax and compile, build, and run it directly from here so I can test it. VI, I could set up to do some of that, but it's going to be a lot more difficult than just launching it from here. Also, setting up syntax highlighting would be a little more difficult. So, but yeah, I know I've said in previous videos I normally use VI. This is about the one exception where I don't. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Also, please check out my previous video, if you haven't already, where I show the bot in action. It's not that exciting. I mean, anyone who's seen Dragon's Lair being played, it's not much different, but I do have the bot on the screen as well, so you can see what's happening in real time. And until next time, take care.